In this lesson, we'll learn how we can make our particles interact with the geometry in our scene by making them bounce off of it. So here's where we left off, and you can open up 0 and 9, add forces, and again, select your particles and go into your ice tree. And here is our current tree. So we are emitting our particles, we're adding a gravity force, and then we're simulating them. So now let's try to find a node that will let us have these particles interact with our surface here. So whenever I'm sort of left in this situation where I need to figure out what a node does or how I can find a certain node that I think exists, I usually start with this search toolbar. So let's see. Well, we're working with particles, so we can always start there. Particles. And well, that's quite a long list to try and figure out which of these are going to do what I want it to do. So let's try going at it from the other way. Let's see, we want these particles to interact with the surface. Well, nope, we don't have anything that says interact with, so now let's try surface. Okay, well, this is a shorter list, so we can scroll down. Alright, so we have something that tests the collision with the surface with a particle. That's close. We can emit from a surface. We've got a surface force, although that will just push the particles around based on its distance. Let's see, we have some getters. We can have it flow. And if we keep scrolling down, we have a section called surface interaction. And this is going to have what we're looking for. And we're looking for the bounce off surface node. So we found this by sort of searching for a few different words. And oftentimes I find that usually the first or even the second search won't get the node I'm looking for. But remember to keep trying different words, or if the search is not working for you, take a look at the tasks. And usually they're pretty self-descriptive. So if we want a surface interaction node, and we want a bounce off surface. So let's drag this in here, and let's drag this underneath our simulate particles node. So this node comes in different from all the other nodes we've had. It comes in this bright red. And that means that there's an error currently on this node, so it's not going to execute correctly. So let's see what it says. It says some attribute is not initialized on an object. Well, that means, or in this case, we need to connect the execute up to our ice tree. Let's connect this up to port 3, or a new port, port 4. Remember, if you see this little empty icon next to a port, as we can see here, and here over here on the left, that means if you connect something to it, it will add a new port to your list. However, our bounce is still broken. So now it's telling us that essentially the geometry is invalid. And so this node needs some information to work off of. So we need to figure out how we can get a surface into our ice tree. So let's type surface into our search here. Let's see, we need to get a surface. So if we scroll down, we can get a distance to a surface. Let's take a look at that. I often drag nodes in to test if the data type they have or output are what I need, but as we can see, we need a purple port or a light purple port, and this does not have one. It does have an input, but not an output, so we can delete this. And I don't see anything that will get me a surface. So what we're going to need to do is use one of the two, in my opinion, most important ice nodes. And those are the get data and the set data. Now, everything in ice, well, almost everything we do in ice, has to do with getting and setting data. So let's go over to our tool palette, and let's jump down to data access. And in here, we have all of the different nodes we'll be using to get and control data. Of course, you could always type get into your search bar and get this node as well. So let's grab a get data node and drop it in. So again, this node turns red because this has an error. So to fix this, we're going to need to double click it. Now the get data node is very simple. It just wants to get some information from our Explorer or from our scene. So what we can do is we can select Explorer and then choose what data we want to get. Well, let's take a look. Well, there's this beaker here. So this is beaker 1. So I want to get beaker 1. So we can either use a pick, which will let us left click it, but I prefer using the Explorer. And let's select beaker 1. And now that we've done that, we now have the beaker 1 object inside of our ice tree. So we can connect this up to our surface, and our node resolves, which means it loses its error red and looks normal again. So we deselect everything and play this through. And we should see a difference now. However, I kind of engineered this so that we would have a problem. So if we take a look at this, let's see what's actually happening inside the ice tree. So if we remember earlier, the ice tree evaluates from top to bottom. So port 1 evaluates first. Okay, so it's emitting particles from a null. So it's emitting particles from that null. Okay, we got that. After the particles are emitted, forces are added to those particles. So it adds a gravity force. Now the important part about this gravity force is that it is not actually changing the current position of the particles. It's just telling the particle that it should be moving. So now that we've given the particle that information, if we go down to port 3, we go to simulate particles. What simulate particles does is it goes through each particle, finds out if there are any forces or anything that is acting or changing those particles, and then it makes those changes. Or in other words, it enacts the changes that are made above it in the ice tree. So after we write out or after we change all of the data with our particles, then we bounce off the surface. Now the problem is that the bounce off the surface is very similar, or works similar to an add forces, in that if it is below or connected after a simulate particles, nothing will happen. That's because it's just giving the information to our particles instead of actually moving them or setting any data itself. So what we need to do is simply switch our bounce off surface and simulate particles so that the simulate particles is after the bounce off surface. So let's grab our port here, and we can move this by just left clicking and dragging from the right side and plugging this into a new port. Now, we don't have to worry about an empty port inside of our ice tree. Now, if we play this back, we see that our particles are now bouncing around inside of our beaker here. Okay, great. So our bounce off surface is working. Now, let me just quickly disconnect my gravity force just for a second so we can see that we need to continue working and adding more things to our bounce off surface. Because now if we play this back, we can see it works in the beaker, but they're not going down this next tube here. So in the next lesson, we'll learn faster ways of getting data into our ice tree so that we don't have to go and use a get data or pull in a get data node and find the beaker. There are a few quicker ways of bringing in this information. So in this lesson, we talked a little bit about how we're going to find different ice nodes inside of our task and toolbar, and various methods of using the search to help us find nodes. We also learned about the extremely important get data node and how we can use it to bring in a surface or an object or model from our scene, and then use a bounce off surface to make our particles bounce or interact with a surface. And we also learned that the ordering of an ice tree's connections is important. So we need to make sure that the simulate particles happens after everything we would want to affect those particles with. Otherwise, those nodes below it will not change the particles unless they explicitly use a set data node. So in the next lesson, we'll continue learning more about ice trees and how to bring in objects quickly.